Does your teen have the necessary skills needed to achieve autonomy? If not, my guest today will show you how to help teens build those important skills by empowering rather than enabling them. I have two guests today, Nicole Kaplan and Peggy Oram. Nicole uses a strength-based approach to help students from ages 6 through adulthood overcome or compensate for learning challenges. She is the founder of Empowered Learning, which provides holistic, comprehensive services for neurodiverse students and parents. Peggy has worked with neurodiverse students of all ages from pre-K to young adults for almost 30 years. Her primary focus is on one-on-one remediation of various types of learning issues. She recently moved from Los Angeles to the greater Nashville area, where she is seeing students in person and virtually. Both of our guests today are ChildNEXUS members, and you can connect with them directly if you have a child, a teen who is in need of educational support. Their contact information is in the show notes. Let's jump in.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by ChildNEXUS.
Nicole and Peggy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having us. We've really been looking forward to speaking with you. We always love that.
I'm excited too. You know, I've seen you all in the ChildNEXUS membership group, and I love the work that you both do. And, you know, been following your work on launching for our older students and thought, okay, I've got to have them on the podcast. And I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate being on.
Yeah. And I mean, you both work with neurodiverse students. You help collaborate with them, their parents, teachers, learning specialists, clinicians to really create a game plan tailored to a student's specific academic and emotional needs. And the work that you do is so important because I know from what I've seen from students who work with educational therapists and specialists like you both, that it can really transform their lives. And, you know, when I see kids, I see them early on, many of them. What we want to do is ensure that children and adolescents we work with get the support that they need. But later on, we want to foster independence so they're not over-reliant on parents and teachers. And we both are doing a lot of work in this space. Can you tell us a little bit, our listeners, about Ready to Launch?
Yeah. So, I mean, Peggy and I have always worked with younger kids, but, you know, we've been doing this long enough that I start seeing a repeat of clients of mine that starts coming back to me sort of with the same issues, but at that higher level. And what we're seeing is that the transfer from school to get it out of school, launching is challenging. So Peggy and I each have a junior in high school, and I have two, and she has one my daughters are graduating from college in 2 weeks, and Peggy's is in right now. So we have really watched this process of watching them try to, you know, mature and grow and try to leave home. And sometimes, you're not doing what you do, and you don't, it's not necessarily the best. And I can tell you, I'm doing it very differently with my son. So even though they gained more independence and took on more responsibility, there were definite gaps in their development. And I think I can speak for both of us that we sometimes feel like we've caused more harm than good as far as taking over and calling and scheduling their appointments, you know, from doctor appointments to haircuts, or not having them be a part of the financial organization and budgeting. I find that that's a big challenge when they go off on their own, and not having them be responsible for household duties more than cleaning your room or making your bed. Because I don't consider those chores. Those are responsibilities that you just need to take care of. Laundry, helping, like I would go in and help organize their room because I couldn't deal with their mess. Like it made me anxious. And, some of the worst things are, and this goes, this is all elementary through high schools, they leave something at home and you rush and take it to school and you do this. I thought that I was like showing them, this is how I showed them love. And that's how I cared, was doing everything and being there for them. I remember getting to points in my life where I would drop what I was doing at my own detriment to go take care of them. And it wasn't healthy and it set up bad patterns. And like I said, I'm doing it very differently for my son.
Yeah. And I think as parents of teens that have weak executive functioning skills already, it's completely understandable because we want them to feel successful. And there's this pattern of, watching them have a hard time. So we want to jump in and, but when rushing in to help or doing things for them, we found that we weren't taking care of teaching them the real skills like problem solving and taking care of things on their own, which ultimately delays their development of executive functioning skills.
Right.
And, this is important because researchers agree that they're not even fully developed till about age 25. So this is really an ongoing process for teens and young adults.
Absolutely. And what you're talking about is really this need for students to achieve autonomy because, we've been focusing so much on their academic skills. So many parents have been focusing on their academic skills and making sure that everything is in place to support them at school and even socially. But what you're talking about is really that next step, which is autonomy. And that relates to executive functioning. I would love for you to talk about the link between, the development of autonomy and how important executive functioning skills are for that process.
Okay. So, the link is really important. So we see clients that have various learning disabilities, right? So regardless of the age, we spend much of our session supporting and implementing academic executive functioning skills when we're working on cognitive skills. And this, so by focusing on the executive functioning skills in this process, it makes the learning process, and we see this, significantly easier. Like the stronger the executive functioning skills, the more likely they are to process and retain the necessary information to succeed academically. So now the whole idea is we want to be able to, as they grow, keep developing that and transfer it into the outside or workforce. And by teaching executive functions, we always say like in the controlled little bubble where it's sort of safe. And then as they get older, we're starting to point out where these same skills are used. Just like if we're teaching expressive language or working on expressive language, it's going to grow as you grow. And that's why I actually see repeat kids coming back every few years working on expressive language at that new level. And it's the same thing with executive functioning.
Yeah. And I think that, we all know that kids learn differently, but it's harder for some kids to learn and master these skills. And you talk about, executive functioning age versus biological age. Could you talk about that? Because I think that's important too, as you talked about executive functioning.
Yeah, that's a really interesting theory, comparing a student's age to their executive functioning abilities. Dr. Russell Barkley has written several books on ADHD, and he's the one that came up with this. He researched the brain's frontal cortex development in children with ADHD and compared it to neurotypical students. And he's credited with this 30% rule, which is a rough estimate, but it says that children with ADHD or EF difficulties or lots of developmental spectrum difficulties tend to operate about 1/3 lower than their biological age. Nicole, you want to give an example of?
Yeah. So, for example, according to this theory, if your child is approximately 8 years old, their executive functioning age is about 5.5. And if your child is 12, their EF age is approximately 8. And 16, your child's EF age is approximately between 10 and 11.
And I've definitely seen this in the students I've worked with and with my own child. And once I became aware of this, I began to understand why certain patterns of behavior seemed out of sync with other kids. And it helped me adjust my expectations and develop goals that were a better match for him. And so when this happened, we saw progress happen more quickly because the goals were matched with where he was really at, not with where I was expecting him to function. And our relationship improved because he started to see how the interventions were helping him, and not just being forced on him. They were part of his learning process.
Right. And that is so important in terms of matching and understanding the discrepancy or the disparities between a child's biological age and their executive functioning age, particularly, as you said, with respect to expectations.
Right. I do think it's important to keep in mind that this is a rule of thumb.
Yes.
And as you said, that every child does learn differently. And it's important to, like we said, consider those when forming the expectations and setting the goals. And that will help us also know when to help and when to jump back a little bit. And so that's kind of what we're going to focus on.
You're talking about executive functioning skills. It's one of our favorite topics to talk about. And it's such a big umbrella term for a lot of different things: planning, organization, problem solving, shifting your focus, self-regulation, all of it. And it's a hot topic. It's an important topic. You spoke about the fact that it overlaps with other academic skills and can enhance the learning of those skills. But these skills are not being taught in schools, are they?
Well, some schools have been doing a great job about teaching these skills, and other schools not so much. And it's generally 99.9% of the time, what I've seen, it's taught in the context of academic skills and not necessarily related to the outside life of the students, their bubble, and where their responsibilities are only centered around themselves and academics. So and every child learns differently, a lot of these kids are slipping through the cracks, and the executive functioning skills are stunted and are overlooked and causing significant struggles academically. So I believe, and we'll get more into this, that we've got to, in the safe bubble, we've got to be able to teach these skills so they're comfortable enough with them that when they go out on their own and the safety net isn't there, that they have some confidence in trying this and problem solving and figuring it out.
And I think even though maybe they are being taught in schools, but there's a lot of students, especially in the population we work with, who aren't processing and retaining it when it's presented. And so they're not being taught how to apply them outside of homework. And they're not necessarily going to make that connection to real life on their own.
And the gap really needs to be filled and teach our children how to use these skills that they're like learning around the academics and apply them to everyday life. Like those are skills that have to be taught. We're teaching them how to do it, or we're modeling the behavior of how to do it academically. Then to take this jump and do it, it's something. When my daughters went to college, I remember one of them called me and said, "Hey, Mom." I go, "Yeah." And she's like, "I really should have listened to you." I'm like, "Well, what are you talking about?" And she's like, I have so much to do. Like, she was an athlete, and she's like, I have, 2 practices a day. I have my sorority. I've got to, do my laundry and stuff like that. And I go, "Well, what about studying?" She goes, "Oh, well, yeah. And that too." she didn't, she's a really smart girl, and, she ended up, at Berkeley, but just because you're intelligent that way doesn't mean you're going to fully succeed if you don't have the executive functioning skills. Thankfully, we were able to figure it all out. But these kids, despite their cognitive abilities, won't always succeed if they can't function in everyday life.
Right. And that's so important because there are a lot of bright kids who struggle because of difficulties with executive functioning. I see it all the time. And I think as parents, you've described your experience with your kids, and I have the same experience where we want to jump in and we want to help, whether it's cleaning the room because it's driving us crazy. Just yesterday, my son dropped his lunch at school and the teacher called me and my car was in the shop. And so I sent an Uber Eats to send him pizza. And but he's 7. So, I got to give him some grace, right? He's not
exactly
18. but that's our human nature, is to kind of jump in and not take away the discomfort from our kids.
We're mom. We want them to feel comfortable. Exactly.
Absolutely. But you both talk about empowering versus enabling. And so how do you describe both, and what do you think parents should do to kind of straddle that balance?
Okay. So before we get into that, I think it's important that we define what we mean by empower versus enabling.
Please do.
So Peggy?
Yeah. So when you empower your child, we think it means helping them build their own skills and setting them up for success to be able to complete a task on their own where they get to take full ownership of that skill.
And in this scenario, enabling is when a parent jumps in and to take care of a situation or a task, even if your child may be capable of doing it on their own. And like we were saying, we tend to do this so our children don't experience frustration. And of course, it's always easier and faster and more efficient if we do it ourselves. And the one thing I think is important is this is how a codependent relationship can start. And codependency, as you know, is a really difficult relationship dynamic. And it could involve things like boundary issues, unrealistic expectations, unhealthy patterns, and can ultimately create animosity, potentially affecting relationships and creating misconceptions of what a relationship is supposed to be like.
Yeah, and this happens when you jump in too soon. So we think that in order to best help your child, you really need to understand their specifics of their executive functioning abilities. They may excel at some things and struggle with others. And there's always going to be peaks and valleys as they learn. So it's going to be very inconsistent.
Yeah. And we always want to jump in, and we don't want to see our kids fail. When their hearts hurt, ours do too.
Absolutely. And I think it's human nature as parents to want to jump in because that's what we've been doing their whole lives, right?
Yeah, it's uncomfortable watching them have a hard time with something. But as we know, learning to manage frustration is one of the key components to learning and developing EF skills.
Absolutely. That's such a good point.
I mean, I definitely learned this the hard way. And I learned that watching them struggle is really what I'm supposed to do. And I found that like parenting is really counterintuitive to what we thought it was. Like we're the observer when we're the child, right? We see the front part. It's almost like watching a show, right? We see this. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes of the parent. And Peggy and I really feel that from the parent perspective, and she and I have talked about a lot, how important it is to keep our own personal anxiety at bay while sitting in a really uncomfortable place, and just keep saying to yourself, like your little mantra over and over, and that it's important to never forget that this is your child's learning process and it's not about our comfort. This is about them and not us, their lesson, not ours.
That's such a good point. And I think it can be a tricky balance sometimes, knowing when to help and when to step back. Now, what if we feel as though our children are not ready for us to completely step back and let them try things on their own? Is there an in-between?
Yes, there is definitely an in-between. And I would say the in-between step is something called scaffolding.
Yeah, scaffolding is, it's a structured framework that breaks down tasks into smaller, more manageable, attainable steps. And that's really important because the reason you're breaking it down is so that the students can feel successful every step of the way and to be able to do each step independently. That's an important part of the process.
So for all of us, we generally look at the big picture and it's often very overwhelming. And breaking large tasks into smaller tasks gives students the ability to do it on their own and experience success, and in turn motivating and building their self-esteem, which will help them try more. So they may start out requiring significant help and then less and less support as they are more comfortable with the process. And once they're comfortable with the process, then they can start doing this on their own. And I think it's important also to remember that the pre-planning of this, you might feel like you're spending a lot of time on this, but in the end, it's setting a student up for success to actually work more efficiently, giving them more time. I always, when I'm working with a client, it's always about like, well, what's our greatest commodity? And we always lead up to the answer that time is our greatest commodity. And so how can we work more efficiently and process as we're doing things versus rereading like 3 times or trying to write a paper 3 times when we can just go through this efficient process, which gives us more time in the end.
Mm-hmm. We actually, when my son was very young, this process is so important that we actually pre-planned activities with the therapist, and then he would have us videotape them, and then he would critique our interactions, what we said, how much help we gave, when we jumped in too soon, even our language. And the hardest part was sitting back and being quiet. So, but with saying that, it's also important to praise and encourage at every step. We want to make sure that these kids notice when they have these small victories. They've oftentimes been so defeated.
Right. And that can be a motivation for them
100%.
to persist, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. And Peggy and I, we talk about how, let's say we do, Peggy, you gave a good example when we were talking about this yesterday, like having to do their laundry. Remember you were talking about that?
Yes. For instance, like if the goal is to have them do their laundry on their own, and maybe they did their laundry, but they threw it in a big pile on the bed. My pet peeve, everything's wrinkled. They don't care.
Right.
Instead of saying, wow, can you fold your laundry? Maybe say something like, hey, I really like that you took the time to get that laundry out and do it. And then pause and let that sit as a compliment and resist the urge to say, next time, ...
Actually, as we're talking about this, I'm thinking like a great thing to say is, you did so great on that. Just like you said, pause, let them internalize it and say, hey, why don't we sit down and fold this together and let's talk about XYZ. So you're modeling the next step. So you're having them do what they're capable of doing. And when it gets a little too challenging, I mean, obviously this laundry is a metaphor for so many things, but you can, sit down and take the next step. So they have a picture in their mind of what it looks like to do the next step. I think that's really important. Mm-hmm. Because maybe they've never really watched you fold the laundry and put it away. Like it's magic,
Right. It just shows up in your drawer, nicely folded.
Exactly. So it's breaking, like we said, scaffolding, breaking things down into smaller manageable parts. And even like the folding part might need to be broken down even more.
Right. And, you talked about scaffolding. What is the easiest strategy to scaffold in the experiences that you both have had?
Okay. So one of our favorite strategies with the scaffolding process is back planning. And I'm happy to go through of what it's sort of like. So this is how it's done. You're going to take a task or a paper or a project or applications for college, whatever it is, and you look at what the end goal is, right? And you work backwards in steps and you ask yourself, what step needs to be done right before attaining this goal? Then you figure that out. Then that thing that you just figured out, that becomes your next goal. And then you ask yourself again, working backwards, what step needs to be taken before attaining this goal?
Right.
Right. And so you keep going and so on and so on. And ultimately, you've just created a checklist of small, manageable, attainable tasks for your child to complete. I also think that you can go within each task and break it down more. So let's say you're doing one task in a day or in that hour or whatever it is. This is how you can do it to get it done. Peggy in our practice for years, and I know you've seen this, is let's use Post-it notes. Let's put a Post-it note on your book with the steps of what you need to do. It's the same thing, but we're just doing it on a bigger scale. So like I said, the strategy can be used for long-term projects in school, getting out the door in the morning, because that's really hard for some people, with all your necessary items, preparing for a job interview, anything. And it can be related to academics, social emotional challenges, in and out of school. I also think it's really important to model this behavior to get and then ultimately get your children involved in the process so then they can take over.
Yeah, this is really the part of the metacognitive piece of executive functioning, where they're thinking about their own learning process, and which is a big part of the problem solving process. So when, often they'll ask us, why are we taking the time to do this? This is a waste of time. Why can't we just get started? I know what I need to do. But we teach them that it's important to break down things into steps, and it's about paying attention to details and making sure they don't miss any steps or instructions along the way.
And we sort of talked about this before, but practicing the skills in your high school and home environment, in the bubble with the safety net, gives the child or student a chance to practice and be able to fail. And it's okay to fail, as we want them to fail there. And so when they go off on their own, maybe they've seen this scenario before, or they're used to now problem solving how to deal with a situation. And so to do it in the bubble versus later where there's more like serious consequences.
Right. And I think that's important what you said about failing, because oftentimes we try and shield our kids from failure. And again, I think that goes back to, again, that human nature to protect them. But we learn so much from failure in terms of to doing things differently, trying a new strategy, problem solving. And like you said, then when they become adults, young adults, they have the experience of failing, but overcoming that failure.
I'm working with a student right now, and we did his goals for the rest of his junior year, summer goals, senior, and then beyond. And one of the things that he said is to learn to deal with his frustration better. So, and in talking with parents and everything, he never experienced frustration. He didn't have to. But it was interesting. One of the things on his list was also cooking. He is starting to think about these things on his own about lifing or adulting in a year and a half. And I thought that was amazing. So those are some strategies that we can work on, even some cooking, which I love.
I've had my son recently, this is embarrassing, tell me like, Mom, you shouldn't do this for me. If I don't get it done, then, I'll just, whatever happens, and then I'll learn and I'll do it for myself. I'm like, wow. If he's telling me, I really need to back off.
Yeah, he's telling you, he's giving you cues in terms of what you need to do.
The other thing is Peggy and I were talking about, like, sometimes if we jump in too soon, it also sends a message that we don't think that they can do it.
Yeah.
That's a good point. That's a really good point. And I think that there are so many misconceptions parents have. Like, they can't do it. They need me to do this for them. Are there other misconceptions that you hear that parents have said? And how do we talk about that?
Yeah, it's frustrating when we think our kids should be doing things as well as their peers or siblings. And if we don't understand why certain things are harder for them than others, or we see them give up easily, we may think they're unmotivated or perceive them as quote unquote lazy. And, possibly make comments like, they're old enough. They should be able to do this.
And I hear this so much, like, you should be reading harder books to challenge yourself and become a better reader. And that is not the best way to go.
And I've been guilty of saying this, I shouldn't have to do this for you now. You're plenty capable.
So the good news is, over the last 20 years, we found that executive functioning skills, you're born with the skill, you're born with the ability to do it. Doesn't mean you're going to be able to do it, but the brains, as you know, are malleable, and these skills are teachable at any time.
Absolutely. And I think that in the end, what parents want to do, and we're all parents here, that we want to raise independent young adults, right? We want them to be autonomous. We want them to feel good about themselves. But we also recognize that some adolescents and some young adults will need more support for a longer period of time. And so that's where some of the misconceptions you talked about kind of come in, where not everybody can just pick up a harder book and read it right away, or not everybody can just be told, okay, now you have to do your own laundry, and just know how to do that without any guidance.
I always say, when I'm talking to parents before they first start, working with me, is that I explain it as there's a lot of kids that can go from A to Z, and they just know it's innate. And then there are the kids that need the steps, the B, the C, the D, the E, the F to get to Z. And that's okay. Like, no one taught them. Like, school was hard for me. No one ever told me that by making pictures in my head, I was going to comprehend. I was a literature major and I wasn't doing it. And at UCLA, you know what I mean? Like, it wasn't until I started teaching kids sort of like, oh, you make pictures in your head to help comprehend, right? That's one of the strategies. Which someone had just told me, I would have just done it. But I didn't know. So these things don't necessarily come naturally. It doesn't mean you're not capable of doing it. It's just, how would I know to do something if it's never been presented as an option, like something to do?
And that's why the work that you both do is so important. And I know that you have resources and support for parents. Would you like to share some of that now? I know I'm going to put links to some of those resources in the show notes.
Yes. So we have a back planning PDF that we are happy to give out. So if they get in touch with us, that we'll send that, as well as a list of things that need to happen before they're ready to launch. So we could do a whole part too, but we have a program, ready to launch. And basically what we're doing is we're scaffolding and back planning these types of skills to be able to get them ready to, whether it be like communication, financial organization. We could keep going, but there's a list of things that we have found, not just as educational therapists, but in our own personal lives, which are our kids, what they need to know to do.
Yeah, and they all tie back to these executive functioning skills. So there's a lot of lists out there that list, be able to do this, do that, do that. But these are actually the thinking and cognitive skills related to that. And we love working with parents one-on-one to create plans in session for, because every child is different. It's not a one size fits all. So we love to get a picture of what their true executive functioning strengths and weaknesses are, and then help parents, utilize the strengths, because we all do that. We all love to do what we're good at, and we should start teaching kids early on. You can go to your strengths. You don't have to be good at everything. You can capitalize on your strengths, and then these other areas, learn some compensation strategies.
And some of those strategies would be, how do I use my strengths, but in that respect?
Right.
So constantly building them up.
And, you've talked a lot about executive functioning, about building autonomy, about making sure that our young people are ready to launch and do things on their own. And it's just been such an important conversation, because I think that parents spend so much time, just getting their kids through school, elementary, middle, and high school. And then it's almost like the sigh of relief. Okay, I'm done.
100%.
But there's still so much to be done to prepare them for life. And like you said, adulting. As we're ending our conversation, any final thoughts that you can wrap up with?
Yeah, lots. Okay. So, let's just remember that these aren't skills that necessarily come easy to kids. And that one thing parents can do is model the positive behavior to support the executive functioning growth. However, they're not going to learn by just watching it. Modeling is important, but the students need to move from observer to gradually becoming an active participant in the process, and which includes the planning stage, literally writing the list. And that's why I actually like the PDF, because it helps just break it down and creates a checklist.
Yeah, and we want to remember that the natural consequences are the most effective ways that our kids learn, when they're allowed to feel the effects of their choices. And so we want them to get as much practice as possible with our support while we're there to troubleshoot and kind of structure their learning process for them.
And if there are parents listening to this who have really young kids, really, really young, even preschool, executive functioning skills should start being taught then. And if you haven't focused on it and your kid is in high school, it's not too late to start. And I think that the transition also is, something that's really important, is I believe in answering the questions of why. And the population of kids that we work with either ask the why, like, well, why do I have to do this? But I also think explaining it gives it context to them and how it will help them later. And to remember, it is a lifelong process, and it can be taught at any age, and it's never too late to start. And to be ready to launch, you're going to need these skills.
Absolutely. Peggy, Nicole, this has been so much fun. It's been an absolute delight. I just love it when people come on and they provide such valuable information to parents and educators that really help a number of kids. What is the best way for parents or educators to connect with you if they want to work with you both or get access to some of the great resources you provide?
I would say probably the best way would be to go to the website, which is empoweredlearning.net. And there's a contact page, and there's a box that says something like, how can we help? So they can ask for any of the PDFs that we mentioned, or if they want to talk to Peggy and I, we'll set up a Zoom call.
Perfect. Thank you both so much for being here. And thank you for all you do to support children and adolescents who think and learn differently. I really appreciate you.
Thank you for what you do.
Thanks, Karen.
Both Nicole and Peggy are members of our ChildNEXUS professional community, professionals who go above and beyond to support students who think and learn differently. If you have a child who is in need of educational support, make sure you go to childnexus.com and search a provider. Many of our educational therapists and specialists are providing support remotely. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by ChildNEXUS. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.